For a long time, being smart meant knowing things. You remembered facts, you learned procedures, you stored information. And if you could recall what you'd learned at the right moment, you were considered capable. That model worked. It worked because the world changed slowly enough for knowledge to stay relevant. If you memorized something, it was likely to remain useful for years. Today, that's no longer true, and many people feel this change without fully understanding it. They study, they read, they learn, but the information doesn't seem to stick the way it used to, or it sticks but fails to apply when conditions shift. This creates a quiet confusion. People assume they're forgetting more, or that their attention is worse, or that they're just not as sharp as they once were. But the problem isn't memory. It's the role memory is being asked to play. Here's the assumption that needs to be questioned. If I memorize more, I'll stay competent. That assumption comes from a stable world. In a stable environment, memorization is powerful. Rules don't change much. Contexts repeat. Patterns stay predictable. But in fast-moving systems, memorization becomes fragile. Not because memory is weak, but because the environment no longer stays still long enough for stored knowledge to remain sufficient. This is where understanding becomes more important than memorization. Understanding is not about storing information. It's about grasping relationships. When you understand something, you don't just know what it is. You know how it connects, why it behaves the way it does, what changes would affect it. Understanding creates flexibility. Memorization creates dependence on stability, and stability is no longer guaranteed. This is why so many people feel like they're constantly relearning the same things. They memorize a concept. The context changes, and suddenly the knowledge doesn't apply anymore. So they memorize again. But memorization doesn't adapt. Understanding does. Understanding allows you to move across situations without starting over. It allows you to recognize patterns even when the surface details change. It allows you to orient yourself when the rules aren't fully clear. This is the shift happening beneath the surface. Intelligence is becoming less about recall and more about interpretation, less about storing and more about seeing. This doesn't mean memory is useless. It means memory is no longer the advantage. Machines retrieve information instantly. Systems store more than any human ever could. Trying to compete on memorization alone is exhausting and unnecessary. The human advantage has always been something else. It's the ability to understand context, to notice what matters, to see meaning where information alone is incomplete. Understanding does something memorization can't. It transfers. If you truly understand a concept, you can apply it in unfamiliar situations. You can adjust when conditions change. You can reason when rules are unclear. Memorization works only when the environment matches what you studied. Understanding works when it doesn't. This is why understanding ages well. Memorized facts decay. Understanding compounds. The more you understand, the easier it becomes to understand new things. Not because you're learning faster, but because you're seeing more clearly. This is where many people feel a subtle relief once this shift clicks. They realize they don't need to chase every new piece of information. They don't need to absorb everything. They need to understand fewer things more deeply. That depth creates leverage. Depth allows you to navigate change without panic. Depth allows you to work with fast systems without being overwhelmed by them. Depth allows you to remain relevant without racing. This is not about slowing down progress. It's about choosing the right level of abstraction. Memorization lives at the surface. Understanding lives beneath it. And beneath the surface is where stability still exists. This is also why understanding feels calmer. Memorization requires vigilance. You have to keep checking whether what you know is still correct. Understanding requires orientation. You know how to evaluate new information as it arrives. You're not threatened by updates. You're not shaken by change. Because you're not anchored to specific facts. You're anchored to how things work. This is what allows people to move forward confidently in uncertain environments. Not because they have all the answers, but because they know how to form good ones. This is the beginning of real capability. Not skill in the narrow sense, but judgment. Judgment is built on understanding. And judgment is what allows humans to work effectively alongside fast, intelligent systems. You don't need to remember everything. You need to know what matters. You don't need to master every tool. You need to understand the problems worth solving. That shift removes a tremendous amount of pressure because it changes the goal. The goal is no longer to keep up. The goal is to see clearly. And clear seeing does not require memorization. It requires attention, context, and time. So if you felt like learning has become harder or less satisfying, this is likely why. You've been trying to use an old strategy in a new environment. Not because you're wrong, but because the environment has changed. And when environments change, intelligence adapts. The people who thrive next will not be the ones who know the most. They will be the ones who understand what they're working with. They will recognize patterns instead of memorizing cases. They will ask better questions instead of collecting more answers. They will stay grounded while systems move quickly around them. This is not a dramatic transformation. It's a quiet one. It begins when you stop treating knowledge like inventory and start treating understanding like orientation. So here is the landing thought for episode 4. You don't need to store more information to stay capable. You need to understand what you're seeing well enough to adapt as it changes. Memorization fades. Understanding transfers. And in a world that won't stop changing, transfer is the real advantage.